The hum of the city stretched far below the towering windows of the Hanson headquarters. From the top floor, Kennedy Hanson's office looked like the control room of a kingdom. All steel, glass, and sharp lines. At 35, Kennedy was a man who had long since stopped chasing dreams and instead ran the machinery that kept them alive. His suit, a deep charcoal that brought out the icy blue of his eyes, was perfectly pressed, though he'd been wearing it since dawn. 3 screens glowed on his desk. A video call with a European investor played in one corner, while financial projections ran on another, and an email draft blinked impatiently on the third. He didn't glance at the clock. He didn't need to. His schedule ran his life, not the other way around. A soft knock at the door broke the rhythm. His assistant stepped in. "Sir, Olive is on the line. She says it's urgent." Kennedy sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Put her through." Olive's voice came sharp and clipped through the speaker. "It's been 2 weeks since we had dinner together, Kennedy. 2 weeks. Do you even realize we're in a relationship?" He leaned back in his chair. "Olive, I told you, this merger. I don't care about the merger. I care about the fact that your assistant hears from you more than I do." Kennedy didn't like arguments. They ate up time he could use on something measurable. "We'll talk over dinner Friday. I'll make a reservation." Her sigh was heavy. "You always think a fancy dinner will fix things. I want your time, Kennedy, not your money." The call ended on a note too sour to salvage. Kennedy stared at the blinking cursor on his email, then went back to typing. By the end of the week, the inevitable happened. Olive met him at a quiet restaurant uptown and ended things between them. No tears, just a final, "You'll never love anyone as much as you love your work." He didn't argue. He didn't even pretend to be surprised. By the time the valet brought his car around, the thought of a late-night meeting had already replaced her in his mind. Sonia Hanson noticed the change immediately. Her brother's love life had always been secondary to his empire, but something about his quiet acceptance of the breakup unsettled her. She brought it up to their mother, Valerie, over afternoon tea in the sunroom of the family's sprawling suburban estate. "I'm telling you, Mom, Olive was never right for him," Sonia said, pouring more tea into her cup. She was always complaining, and she didn't understand how driven Kennedy is. Valerie stirred her tea slowly. "Kennedy hasn't brought home a single woman since..." "What?" 3 years until Olive, and it has finally come to an end in less than a month. That isn't healthy." "I know." Sonia set her cup down with a faint clink. "But I've been thinking. You remember my best friend, Vania?" Valerie's brow arched. "Vania Godfrey? Of course I remember. Sweet girl, always so polite when she visited. Lovely manners, and she actually listens when people talk to her." Sonia smiled, seizing the opening. "Exactly. She's warm, grounded, and she knows how to balance life and work, something my dear brother has no clue about." Valerie leaned back in her chair. "You're suggesting we arrange something?" "I'm suggesting we give them a chance to be in the same room without it feeling forced. You know, casual family visits, a few shared dinners. I can invite her when I know Kennedy's around." Her mother considered this. "I wouldn't be against it. She's the kind of woman who could steady him. But you know Kennedy. He won't appreciate feeling manipulated. That's why he won't know." Sonia's smile was conspiratorial. The first step of the plan was almost too easy. On a Saturday evening, Sonia invited Vania over under the pretense of helping with a charity auction she was organizing. The Godfrey Hanson connection wasn't new. Vania had been friends with Sonia since their university days. She was striking in a quiet way, her skin a warm caramel tone, her curls gathered into a neat bun, and her style a blend of classic and modern. She carried herself with a natural grace that made people lower their voices around her. When she arrived, Valerie welcomed her with a hug. "Vania, dear, it's been too long. You look radiant." Kennedy was in the living room, laptop open, reading through a quarterly report. Sonia made the introductions as if they'd never met. You remember my brother Kennedy? He glanced up briefly, polite but distracted. Of course. Nice to see you again. Vania smiled warmly. You too. For the rest of the evening, Kennedy kept mostly to himself, occasionally joining the conversation but always with one eye on his screen. Vania didn't push. She helped Sonia sort auction items, laughed with Valerie in the kitchen, and chatted with the housekeeper about recipes. Kennedy noticed, not that she was trying to get his attention, but that she didn't seem to need it. The next few weeks saw a subtle shift. Sonia made sure Vania's visits coincided with Kennedy's time at home. Sometimes it was a Sunday lunch, other times an evening when they watched a film together in the family's media room. During one of these evenings, Kennedy overheard Vania and Sonia discussing a fundraiser for underprivileged youth. Vania's voice carried a calm conviction that made him pause in the hallway. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She simply cared about what she was doing. Another night, he came home to find her in the kitchen with Valerie, sleeves rolled up, helping to prepare dinner. She laughed easily, the sound warm and unself-conscious. The first real conversation between them happened almost by accident. Sonia had forgotten to join them in the living room after dinner, leaving Kennedy and Vania with coffee cups and an awkward silence. Vania broke it first. Sonia tells me you're expanding into renewable energy. Kennedy looked up, curious. I am. It's the future. Oil and gas aren't sustainable. I've been reading about solar projects in developing countries, she said. It's amazing how a small amount of infrastructure can change an entire community. He found himself explaining his own plans, the potential markets, the technological challenges. She listened intently, asked thoughtful questions, and even made a few suggestions he found surprisingly insightful. When Sonia finally returned, Kennedy wasn't ready to end the conversation. From then on, something shifted. He began to notice her in ways he hadn't before. The way her eyes crinkled when she laughed, the way she remembered details from their talks, the quiet confidence she carried. One Friday evening after a family movie night, Sonia insisted Vania stay over rather than drive home late. Valerie happily prepared the guest room. As Kennedy passed by later, he saw her unpacking a small overnight bag. He paused, leaning against the doorframe. Good night, Vania. She looked up, a little surprised but smiling. Good night, Kennedy. He lingered a moment longer than necessary before walking away, a thought forming in the back of his mind. Maybe Sonia had been right about him needing someone in his life. By the end of that week, the Hansons' casual invitations to Vania were becoming routine. To Kennedy, it was still just friendly company, or at least that's what he told himself. But the truth was, he'd started checking the calendar for when Sonia said Vania was coming over. What he didn't know was that this was only the beginning of a plan two women were quietly orchestrating in the background, and that plan was working exactly as intended. The first time Kennedy asked Vania out without Sonia's prompting, it was for something as simple as coffee. He told himself it was because he had an extra hour between meetings and didn't feel like spending it alone. She met him at a quiet cafe downtown, wearing a soft cream sweater and her hair in loose curls. He noticed the faint scent of vanilla when she leaned in to greet him. They talked about unremarkable things. The new exhibit at the art museum, a book she'd just finished, a ridiculous news headline. But he found himself strangely reluctant to end the meeting. 2 weeks later, they met again for lunch. Then came a Saturday evening stroll in the park, followed by dinner at a cozy restaurant where the low lighting softened the edges of the world around them. Sonia noticed instantly. One afternoon, she spotted Kennedy on the phone, leaning back in his office chair with the ghost of a smile on his face. He didn't even notice her in the doorway until she spoke. So, how's Vania? He gave her a flat look. She's fine. Fine, Sonia repeated, clearly unconvinced. Fine is not the word for a woman who makes you smile like that. Kennedy ignored her, but the truth was undeniable. He liked Vania's company. Vania, for her part, had never been on dates like these before. Kennedy's world was a whirlwind of fine dining and luxury, yet she never felt out of place. He treated her with quiet respect. never rushing her, never pressuring. But she also sensed the wall he kept between them, an invisible line he didn't want her to cross. One evening after dinner, they walked through the city streets. She glanced at him as they passed a bookstore window. "You work a lot," she said softly. He gave a half smile. "That's an understatement." "Why?" she asked. "I mean, I know you have a lot of responsibility, but you could ease up a little." Kennedy's jaw tightened. "My father once lost everything we had because he thought things would run themselves. I can't risk that. Not again." She didn't push. But in that moment, she understood just how deep his fears ran. As winter gave way to spring, their dates became less frequent. Kennedy's calendar was swallowed whole by a massive business merger, late nights, weekend calls, endless negotiations. Vania tried to be understanding, but the silences between them stretched longer. Sometimes she wouldn't hear from him for 3 days. When they did meet, he was distracted, checking his phone between sentences. Over lunch with Sonia one afternoon, Vania finally voiced her worry. "I feel like I'm chasing him," she said, stirring her coffee. Sonia sighed. "If you want my brother, you'll have to fight for space in his life. He won't just hand it over. He's too conditioned to think work comes first." Vania knew Sonia was right. And she also knew she didn't want to lose what they had. Not when she'd seen the version of Kennedy that appeared when he let his guard down. Her new approach was simple. Go to him. On her next day off, she cooked a meal: lemon herb chicken, roasted vegetables, fresh bread, and packed it neatly into containers. She showed up at his office just before noon, balancing the bag on one arm. His assistant blinked in surprise. Mr. Hanson isn't expecting anyone." Vania smiled. "That's fine. Could you just let him know I'm here?" When Kennedy stepped into the lobby, his tie was loose, his brow creased with numbers and deadlines. The moment he saw her, some of the tension slipped away. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "I brought lunch," she said simply. Inside his corner office, she unpacked the meal while he cleared a space on his desk. He started to protest about his workload, but she cut him off. "You can eat and work, or you can eat and talk to me. Your choice." He smirked despite himself. "You're bossier than you look." For the next 40 minutes they talked, not about the merger, but about music, travel, and childhood stories. By the time she left, Kennedy felt lighter than he had in weeks. It became a pattern. On her off days, she would drop by with food or sometimes just coffee and pastries. Sometimes she stayed only 20 minutes. Other days she lingered, coaxing him into short walks outside. At first, he told himself it was a distraction he couldn't afford, but soon he caught himself looking forward to her visits, glancing at the clock when noon approached. One rainy evening, she arrived at his office to find the lights still on at 10 p.m. He was standing by the window, jacket off, shirt sleeves rolled up, looking out at the storm. "You're still here," she said softly. He turned, startled. "I could say the same about you. I was in the neighborhood." She set a paper bag on his desk. "Dinner." This time he didn't resist. They sat on the small sofa by the window, eating while the rain tapped against the glass. "You ever think about taking a break?" she asked suddenly. "A break? From work? Even just for a weekend?" He shook his head. "There's too much at stake." She studied him for a moment, then said, "You're afraid." The words hit harder than he expected. "Afraid of what?" "Of losing everything," she said. "But you're also losing time you'll never get back." He didn't reply right away. They sat in silence, the city lights flickering on the wet streets below. Finally, he spoke. "I don't know how to stop." "Then let me help you." It happened almost without thinking. He leaned toward her, she didn't pull away, and their lips met in a quiet, unhurried kiss. When they parted, Kennedy looked at her for a long moment. "You're not going to give up on me, are you? Not if you don't give me a reason to." From that night on, something shifted. Kennedy still worked long hours, but he began making small changes, leaving the office earlier once or twice a week, setting aside his phone during dinner. They went on a weekend getaway to the coast, walking barefoot on the sand, eating at little seafood shacks and watching the sunset in comfortable silence. They laughed more too, at his terrible attempts at cooking, at her competitive streak during board games. But even as their bond grew stronger, the shadow of his work habits lingered. He still sometimes canceled plans last minute, still got pulled into emergencies that left her eating dinner alone. Vania didn't complain, but she knew something would eventually have to give. For now, she chose to focus on the progress they had made. The fact that the man who once barely noticed her now kissed her goodnight and called her just to hear her voice. And though she wouldn't admit it out loud, she had begun to imagine what it might be like if things continued this way. If the slow-burning connection between them became something permanent. She didn't know it yet, but the test of that hope was just around the corner. The first sign that things were sliding came quietly. It was the week of Vania's birthday. Sonia had planned a small dinner at the family estate. Valerie would cook, Sonia would decorate, and Kennedy, well, he was supposed to arrive at 7 sharp. By 6:30, Vania was already there, wearing a simple but elegant emerald dress that brought out the warm undertones of her skin. She helped Valerie set the table, smiling whenever Sonia teased her about how much effort she'd put into her appearance. By 7:30, the candles had burned low and the food was starting to cool. Kennedy had texted once, running late, big deal closing. Don't wait for me. Sonia's eyes narrowed at the message. Unbelievable. Valerie tried to soften the mood. Let's just eat, dear. He might still come after. But Kennedy didn't. 2 days later, he showed up at Vania's apartment, holding a small wrapped box. I'm sorry, he said as soon as she opened the door. The deal was more important than my birthday, she finished for him. Her voice wasn't angry, just tired. It wasn't like that, he said, stepping inside. This merger could change everything. She shook her head. That's the problem, Kennedy. Everything is always more important than us. And I've tried. I've really tried to make space in your world, but it feels like I'm the only one doing it. His jaw tightened. So what are you saying? I'm saying maybe we need some time apart. The words hung between them like a physical thing. Kennedy opened his mouth, closed it again, and finally nodded once. If that's what you want. The days that followed were a blur for Kennedy. He threw himself into work with even more intensity, telling himself it was better this way, less distraction, fewer complications. But at night, in the silence of his penthouse, the emptiness pressed in. There were no late-night calls from Vania, no texts asking if he'd eaten, no warm voice teasing him out of his stress. It was Sonia who broke the stalemate. She showed up unannounced one evening, tossing her coat over the back of his sofa. You look like hell, she said without preamble. I'm fine, he replied. You're not. And you're turning into Dad before he lost everything. His head snapped up. That's not fair. It's the truth, she shot back. You're so afraid of failing that you're sabotaging the one thing that could keep you from turning into a bitter old man with nothing but his money. Kennedy's silence told her she'd hit her mark. That night he lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He thought about Vania's patience, her quiet support, the way she had slipped into his life without asking for anything but his time. And he realized Sonia was right. He had been losing her long before that birthday dinner. The next morning, Kennedy did something he hadn't done in years. He cleared his entire schedule. No meetings, no calls, no emails. He stopped at a florist, then at a small stationery shop where he picked out a thick, cream-colored sheet of paper. Back at his desk, he began to write. The letter was simple. No grand flourishes, just the truth. He told her about his fears, how watching his father's mistakes had carved an obsession into him. He admitted he'd been wrong to think he could build a life without making space for love, and he told her she mattered more than any business deal could. When he knocked on her door that afternoon, Vania opened it slowly, surprise flickering in her eyes. Kennedy, she said, her voice guarded. He handed her the bouquet, deep red roses mixed with white lilies, and the folded letter. "I took the day off," he said, "to tell you I was wrong, and that I don't want to lose you." She hesitated, then stepped aside to let him in. While she read, he stood by the window, heart pounding harder than it ever had before a board meeting. When she finally looked up, there was a softness in her expression. "You mean this?" "Every word." Vania set the letter down and walked toward him. "Then prove it. Not with flowers, not with fancy dinners, or with your time. Show me you can be here even when it's inconvenient." He nodded. "I will." The weeks that followed were different. Kennedy still worked hard. It was in his nature. But he set boundaries. He left the office by 7 most nights. He started taking weekends off. They rebuilt slowly, going on quiet dinners, weekend drives, even lazy Sundays where they cooked breakfast together and stayed in their pajamas until noon. Valerie noticed the change immediately, her eyes lighting up whenever Kennedy and Vania arrived at the house together. Sonia, smug as ever, reminded her mother that she had called it from the start. The proposal came 6 months later, during a family gathering in the Hansons' garden. Kennedy had arranged for string lights to be hung among the trees, their glow softening the evening air. After dinner, he stood, took Vania's hand, and led her to the center of the lawn. "Vania Godfrey," he said, his voice steady, "you've taught me that success means nothing without someone to share it with. You've shown me patience, kindness, and a love I didn't think I deserved. Will you marry me?" Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded. "Yes." Valerie cried openly, while Sonia clapped so hard her hands stung. The wedding was elegant but intimate, a ceremony in the garden where it had all started, attended by close family and friends. Kennedy wore a classic black tuxedo. Vania's gown was simple satin, her curls gathered under a veil that shimmered in the late afternoon sun. They exchanged vows beneath an archway of white roses, promising not just love but time, the one thing they had learned was most precious. The honeymoon was a dream, a private villa on the Amalfi Coast, days spent exploring colorful seaside towns, nights under the stars with nothing but the sound of waves. Kennedy kept his phone off, completely off. For the first time in years, he let the world spin without him. A year later, the Hansons gathered again, this time to welcome the newest member of the family. Vania sat in the sunroom, cradling their newborn daughter, her dark curls a miniature version of her mother's. Kennedy stood beside her, one hand resting gently on her shoulder. Sonia leaned over the bassinet. "She's perfect. You did good, big brother." Valerie, her face glowing with joy, looked from her son to her daughter-in-law. "I always knew this would work out." Kennedy smiled down at his daughter, then at Vania. "You're the reason I finally understood. Love and success aren't enemies. They make each other stronger." Vania's fingers curled around his. "And you're the reason I know patience can be worth it." As the baby stirred in her arms, the evening light bathed the room in gold, wrapping them in a quiet certainty, the kind that only comes when a plan, and a love, has truly worked. Thank you so much for watching and supporting my channel. Your love, comments, and shares mean everything to me. Grateful for each of you. Let's keep growing together. With love from Whispers of Hope.